etc. She's also the principal investigator of a very interesting project called Compromise that analyzes under what conditions citizens are willing to accept compromise policies. So I think that in a society as ours, this is really important, no? In the middle of the polarization area to study. Maca is a specialist in the analysis of panel data. That, as you know, and especially this is important for young people, panel data is another strategy to deal with causal difference, which is really important. There is not only experiment, but also panel data, and have the property of external validity. So I think that it is important to have people like Macarena showing the results of their analysis and their research, because we shouldn't stop pushing for public compromise to produce data, panel data, especially in Spain, that we really miss it, no? So this is why I thought it was really important to bring someone like Maca. Last but not least, Maca is part of the team of the research network, The Progressive, which is a team that tries to put together a lot of researchers with the goal to make scientific findings more accessible to the public, the general public. And they have a web with the activities they develop, and I think they could be very inspiring for us in the context of the Plan Max, and also for Pablo. I think I sent him the link, and by coincidence I just discovered that Professor Jane Grignich, who is part of our external committee of the Plan Max, is involved in this research network. So I thought it was a nice coincidence. Anyhow, I think we're really lucky to have you. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, Maca, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marta, for the nice presentation, and thank you for inviting me to present today. As Marta was saying, I have a project on compromise. I won't be presenting on that today because the project has started rather recently, and actually we're now in the process of data collection. We're fielding some surveys, but stay tuned because there will be hopefully some results from that project in the short to medium term. Short term is always a bit longer than what we expect. And then also thank you, Marta, for pointing out this Progressive Politics Research Network. This is something that we work on together with colleagues from Zurich, from Berlin, from Vienna, from Oxford. And we're trying to make an effort to try to make research available to a wider public, to an interested public. And so we are always also looking for other examples of how to do this successfully, because I think that it's not an easy task and we don't always know the tools to do that. And you will find that actually some of the research I have done on class voting and the transformation of left-wing parties and the electorates of left-wing parties appears in some of the research briefs and policy memos that have been published on our website. And so, yes, it would be interesting, and it would be a great favor to us if you followed us. And then I think there are also some materials there that can be useful also sometimes for teaching as well, because some of these research briefs are worded in plain language, let's say, and in figures and so on that can be more easily understood by students. So yes, thank you for pointing that out. So what's my talk today about? So today I will be talking about class voting, and particularly the role of intergenerational socialization into different classes. This is a line of work that I've been working on already for quite a while, and a lot of this work, particularly on intergenerational transmission of preferences and attitudes, I'm doing with my colleague Matilde von Dietmars, who's now at the University of Milan. And so for a while already, we've seen that there has been a renewed emphasis, a renewed focus on class voting, on social class as an important determinant of policy preferences, issue preferences, and political behavior. This wasn't always the case, right? At the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, there were many papers discussing whether class was dead or not, so arguing that class wasn't important to understand politics anymore. But I feel like we have overcome that discourse or that debate between class is dead, class is not dead. And this discussion and this debate has evolved into a different direction, both in the academic debate and in the media, to not think about whether class is dead or not, but to really try to focus on what is different about class voting today, right? And a lot of that can be framed within this framework that some authors have labeled the post-industrial realignment thesis, which is basically the idea that there is still a link between social class and voting, between social class and preferences, but that this link is different from the one we observed in industrial societies, right? And this is why we talk about realignment, because classes have realigned with different political parties. And the two major trends that have been identified refer in particular to left-wing parties broadly understood, because we see that there has been an increasing support for the left among the middle classes, and particularly among certain groups within the middle class, the sociocultural professionals. These are professionals in social occupations, journalists, social workers, medical doctors, teachers, and so on. And so we see that they're increasingly attached to left-wing parties or increasingly voting for left-wing parties. And at the same time, I don't have to tell you much about this because I think it's quite an established fact by now, that workers have increasingly voted for the radical right. So we really see an important transformation, particularly in the electorate of left-wing parties. And there is very extensive documentation of these new alignments across the literature. And not only is there a documentation of this link between social class and voting, but also increasingly so there is research that is looking at this from a longitudinal perspective, right? So really with panel data, trying to see how really individuals' own class position, so for instance, when individuals start working in a certain profession or occupation, how that impacts people's economic, cultural, and party preferences. So trying to identify what in political sociology has sometimes been named the socialization effect of class, right? So how people's preferences change when they enter a specific class location. And some of this I have done together also with my colleague Mathilde von Dittmars, but there are other authors who have looked at that as well, right? So there is a lot of evidence that class matters for voting. There is a lot of evidence that some of this effect is partially a socialization effect of class, so really trying to identify this causal effect of class location. But at the same time, where we're going with this line of research is that we think we have to take into account that some of the processes that underlie this broader transformation of political realignment, like occupational upgrading, so the transformation of the class structure, the tertiarization of the economy, or even this realignment, the appearance of new parties, these are rather recent processes, right, that have taken place over the last 20, 30 years. And we think that it is important that we bring this time dimension into consideration when we're trying to understand what explains some of these alignments that we see today. And in particular, we think that this is important because we see quite high levels of intergenerational absolute mobility, right? This means people whose class position is different from their parents. There are more people who are moving up in terms of absolute mobility. There's a whole discussion in the sociology literature about whether relative mobility has gone up or not. Here we're not talking really about relative mobility, but absolute mobility. The fact that people come to occupy a class position, a socioeconomic status that is higher than their parents. And so, in fact, if we look at the distribution, at the composition of the middle class in Europe today, we will see that a big part of the middle class has actually its roots in the working class. So, for instance, when we talk about sociocultural professionals, about 30% of them in the UK, in Germany, and Switzerland have working class parents. But obviously, as I was saying, because this is a recent process, we're observing that this is also changing over time, right? And among younger generations, we are observing fewer individuals who have those working class parents, right? So if we think about this and if we use the terminology from the intergenerational mobility perspective, the class of origin, the likelihood to have different classes of origins is changing over time because of this level of upgrading of the occupational structure. And so what we want to ask with this research is to what extent the left-wing support among the middle class that we observe today is grounded on the fact that many of these people were actually growing up in the working class, right? So if we think about the parental class of socialization, many of these people have working class backgrounds. So what we try to quantify and observe here is to what extent we still see a legacy of that parental class of origin in the alignments we see today. And we're also asking this question because in some of the longitudinal analysis that we've done, we find that if we look at, so we look at people's, how to say it, so that we look at individuals' differences in economic and cultural preferences by class of destination, but before people have entered that class. So for instance, we look at to what extent voters who are, individuals who are 16 to 20 years old differ in terms of their preferences based on the class that they will hold in the future when they are 35, 40 years old. And we do find that there are quite some significant differences by then, right? So that there is also a kind of selection process or sorting process that is taking place earlier. And we think that maybe some of these differences can be explained by parental class of origin, right? That this could be explaining why individuals hold certain attitudes, and that this might also be explaining different patterns for individuals along the life course. Disclaimer, we are not looking at this from a longitudinal perspective yet. So what I will show you today is based on cross-sectional data, but we want to repeat this with panel data. And I will tell you a little bit about the directions in which we want to go, because due to data availability, there's different things we can do with different kinds of data. And so we think that, okay, so we are observing some differences before people have entered the class location. We also know that there has been, that this process of occupational transformation and realignment has taken place more recently. We need to account for this. And there are different reasons to expect parents and parental class of origin to play an important role in attitude formation, right? There's substantive literature in socialization and political socialization that have emphasized the role of parents as important socializing agents during the impressionable years. Some of this is happening through modeling and imitation of parents and children, social learning and development of political preferences during this period in the impressionable years. And then there are also there's also some intentional transmission, right, on the parts of parents to children on instilling certain values, certain preferences, or certain ideologies. So that would be a direct mechanism linking parental class of origin to preferences and to socialization. There could also be some indirect mechanisms, right, in the sense that we know that socioeconomic status is partly inherited, right? And that children from more advantaged backgrounds tend to have more advantages, more options to move upward or to maintain a higher level of socioeconomic status. So it could also be that some of the effects of parental class of origin are operating through more of this economic or even subjective identification, right? We think that maybe some of this is also going through subjective class identification. And so what I'm going to show you today is results on this, right? On how much of the class differences that we observe today can be grounded on growing up in different social classes. We're also looking at different generations to kind of see this effect of this realignment process that I was telling you about, right? Because, and this is why we're talking about new milieus of left-wing, of intergenerational left-wing socialization, because we do not expect the same effects of growing up in the working class, in a working class in the 40s or 50s, or growing up in the working class in the 80s or 90s. Because the alignment of these classes, the political alignment of these classes has changed over time, right? We are seeing that workers tend to vote less for the left, more for the right, and we see that the middle class is increasingly working for the left. And so also in terms of more of like the implications for political parties, I think it's also interesting to ask ourselves whether this new left-wing middle class also provides this context of left-wing socialization for future generations or not, right? Because this is also going to determine to what extent this will be a sustainable, let's say, legacy that left-wing parties could be mobilizing. Because, as I was saying, this partisan realignment is a recent and gradual phenomenon. So we're trying to get at this, but I will tell you about this in the data and methods. And so as a first step, we're looking at differences in political behavior, but then as a second step, we're also trying to disentangle through which mechanism this legacy is operating. And so we want to look at whether it is mainly through ideological orientation, so whether people with different class backgrounds have different ideologies, whether this is transmitted in terms of party identity, so not a general ideology left or right, but closeness to a particular political party or party family. We're also looking at specific issue preferences and values, trying to separate economic values from cultural values. And then something else we want to look at, but we're not looking at that yet, is differences by subjective class identification, right? So whether some of these mechanisms are going through subjective class identity, but we don't have this in this data. That's the problem, that it's hard to find out good data about intergenerational, about the parental class of origin. It's not easy data to come by at a detailed level. This is why for now we are working with with European social survey data from rounds 1 to 5, because from round 5 onwards, the ESS stops coding parental class in 3-digit ISCO codes, which is what we need to assign people to their parental class of origin. So from rounds 1 to 5, and it's even in additional files, so it's not something that you find immediately because it's not in the main data set of the ESS. But the ESS systematically did the job of coding information about fathers and mothers' occupation when the respondent was 14 years old at a 3-digit level, that if you look at it, it's very detailed information. And so for each individual with this data, we're able to code parental occupation, and we do so by using father's class and then mother's class when father's class is missing. We have also run this same analysis using the highest class out of the two. But the problem we had with that coding is that in some cases, with the class scheme that I will show you now with ÖSH, there isn't always a hierarchical dimension to it, because there's a qualitative dimension to that. And so there were some cases where people had middle class parents of different occupation, and then it was tricky to code which one is not higher than the other. So then even then, when there was a match between the level, we went for father's class. And the outcomes that we will be looking at are party preferences. And so this is both recall from the last national election. This is the data that is available at the ESS. And we're coding this into different party families because we're using all of the ESS Western European countries. And then at the mechanism level, we will be looking at ideological self-placement, preferences for redistribution, preferences on immigration, preferences on the rights of lesbians and gays, and then closeness to a particular party as a way to capture political identity. Sorry, party identity. This is what I was telling you about the operationalization of social class. What we're doing here is that we are borrowing ÖSH class scheme, which is a class scheme that tries to include not only that hierarchical dimension and distinction between middle class and professional occupations and working class occupations. These are low and mid-skilled occupation. But it is also incorporating another trait that is very specific to post-industrial societies, which is the growth of the service sector, right here. So to differentiate, particularly among professional occupations, between those teachers, journalists, social workers, medical doctors, those socio-cultural professionals, and then other middle class occupations. To simplify even a little bit more the analysis, we separate, or we recode a scheme into fewer classes. And in particular today, what I will be showing you is, because of this transformation and this realignment, the most interesting classes to look at are particularly workers and sociocultural professionals, right? Because these are the two classes that have shifted in their alignment with left-wing or right-wing parties. And we will be using as our reference category the old middle class, and this includes both associate managers and people in administration and managing roles, as well as large employers and self-employed professionals, which kind of represents, right, the traditional old middle class, also from an industrial background. And we keep this as the reference because this is one of the classes for which we do not expect their partisan allegiance or their political preferences and ideology to have changed over time, right? While the others are shifting. And so it's important to have that as a reference category. And so I will be showing you results for these three different classes. And then, as I was telling you, we're trying to add another dimension, which is to try to see to what extent these parental legacies change throughout the different stages of realignment. But we are not measuring stages of realignment, we are using generations as a proxy for that, right? So we're differentiating between 4 generations: the silent generation, the baby boomers, Gen X, and millennials, to try to get at whether this has changed over time. The models will control for respondents' own class, so everything I will show you will already be taking into account where individuals stand in the social structure at the time they were surveyed. And we're also controlling for gender, age, marital status, and level of education. We run the same analysis without level of education because this is sometimes a controversial control when you're looking at the effects of class. This is always something that reviewers are bringing up. If you include them, to exclude it. If you don't have it, to include it. So we run the different models, but the results are very similar. And the models are estimated through conditional logic for party preferences because we have different party families, or OLS for ideology and issue positions. And something that I should tell you also is that in the models for party preference, which is vote recall, we also have abstention as another category. I will not be showing you the results for that, but that is also a category that is included in the analysis. So the results that I'm showing you already have into account that that's another possibility in the choice set, right, to not vote in an election. Okay, so what do we see? What I'm going to show you first, as I told you, these are marginal effects with respect to our reference group, which is the old middle class. And what we're looking at here is the impact of parental class on preference for on voting for different party families. These are marginal effects in terms of predicted probabilities, right? So what we see first is that workers, even when we control, offspring of workers, even when we control for these people's own class location, are more likely to vote for social democratic parties than individuals who have their origins in the old middle class, so who have parents in the old middle class. So we see a left-wing legacy, let's say, on the part of having working class parents. It's about 7.5% more likely to vote for the Social Democrats.
Sorry, that's for the whole of Europe.
This is for all of Europe. We also do this analysis separately by regions of Western Europe, or kind of like welfare state systems in a sense, so separating continental Europe from Scandinavian countries, liberal regimes, and Southern Europe. And the patterns are very similar. Only for Southern Europe, the extent of realignment that we see is lower than what we see in the rest of Europe, which is not surprising. I can say a little bit more about this also in the Q&A. And I think also something important to see here is that when we look at class of destination, sociocultural professionals, so people's own class, them being sociocultural professionals, does increase their likelihood to vote social democratic. But we do not observe the same for that as a class of origin, right? So people who had parents who were sociocultural professionals are not more likely to vote for the Social Democrats than the old middle class, right? So already pointing out that maybe we do not observe this left-wing legacy anymore. But this is for the Social Democrats, right? We also can look at the radical left, and here we see that already the effects are smaller, right, in comparison to that effect of having working class parents. But we see a positive effect for workers, and here also we see a positive effect for the children of sociocultural professionals, right? So showing an attachment to a left-wing parties, but for the radical left instead of the Social Democrats. And we see a very similar pattern if we look for green parties, right? So we see that there seems to be a legacy of having sociocultural professional parents, but it is not for the Social Democrats. It is rather for the Greens and the radical left. And interestingly here, having working class parents makes people less likely to vote for green parties. And when we look at the mechanisms, you will see why some of this is taking place. I can already tell you, because having working class parents makes you more culturally authoritarian, right? And so that decreases your likelihood of voting for green parties. We see throughout a negative effect on the probability to vote for the center, right? So in a sense, generating that attachment to the left decreases the likelihood of voting for the mainstream right. So we see that children who have working class parents are 10% less likely to vote for the center right than children with old middle class parents. We also see an effect for sociocultural professional parents. And I think it's also interesting to note that we do not observe a legacy for radical right parties, right? So that individuals who have working class parents are not more likely to vote for the radical right. It is interesting, right, to see, because, for instance, right, this expectation about could the working class now be a milieu of socialization for the radical right? Obviously, we don't expect this to be the case. We expect this to be the case more recently, right? Because a realignment of the working class has taken place recently. And this is why we now look at this separately by generation. And so there is a lot of information here. Let me point to you some of the most interesting findings. The first thing to note, and I have to apologize for this graph because the scales are not the same, because otherwise it made it too large for the slide. So there was a trade-off between looking nice on the slide and being more informative. But you don't see this here. But the largest effect we observe for class of origin is for workers in the oldest generation, in the silent generation. So individuals who belong to the silent generation, who had working class parents, are 10% more likely to vote for the Social Democrats than the old middle class. And we never observed such a large effect for any other generation or any other party. What we do observe over time is that this, you have to believe me here because with the scale maybe you don't see it so well, but we see that this social democratic legacy among the children of workers is declining over time, right? And if we go to the group of millennials, we see that having working class parents only increases the likelihood of voting social democratic by about 2.5%, right? In comparison to that 10% in the oldest generation. And we do see in the case of sociocultural professionals, right, as the other interesting potential milieu of left-wing socialization, an increasing alignment over time or over generations with left parties, but this is in particular with the new left, the radical left and the Greens, not necessarily social democrats. So as a summary, right, in the case of working class origins, we see this 10% that we do not observe for any other class comparison or generation, right? That dilutes over time. And there's no evidence of increasing radical right legacy, which I think is also interesting, right? If we go into the youngest generations, the millennials, having working class parents doesn't increase their likelihood of voting for the radical right. And in the case of the sociocultural middle class origins, we see that this legacy remains rather constant over time, and that it is particularly for the radical left and the Greens. And we see a constant negative difference, right, in terms of center-right support for both groups. So that doesn't change. But we do not observe, and this is something that we cannot really account for also when we look at the mediation studies, when we try to look at the mediation, right? We cannot really pinpoint exactly what's driving such a strong legacy for the working class in the silent generation, not with the variables that we're including in our analysis, which is what I will show you now. So what we're trying to do here is to look at how this legacy operates. So is this increasing vote for the Social Democrats, for the, in the case of children of workers, or sociocultural professionals, is this driven by an attachment to the left-wing ideology? Is it driven by particular values? Is it driven by closeness to a particular political party? And what we do here is first to look at ideological self-placement, and all of these variables, this is all data as I was telling you from the ESS, and all of these variables have been standardized to be able to compare the size of effects of coefficients across models. So the scale is not related to the response scale of the questions. Yes, and so and they have been recoded so that left always means more progressive, either in economic or in cultural terms. And so first, what we see is that some of these effects seem to be operating through these factors, right? So for instance, if we look at ideology, we see that the offspring of workers and the offspring of sociocultural professionals are more likely to place themselves towards the left of the ideological scale than people who have old middle class parents, right? But if you look at this here, right, you're already seeing that this effect is marginally larger, at least equal, right, for sociocultural professionals and workers. So we are already seeing, and this is a conclusion, let's say, from our analysis, that we cannot completely account for why this working class legacy is stronger for the left than the one we see for sociocultural professionals. But if we see similar patterns in terms of economic preferences, in the sense that having both working class parents and sociocultural professional parents makes individuals more favorable towards redistribution. But then if we look at the cultural issues, right, the direction of this or of these differences for the children of workers and sociocultural professional changes, right? And so even if both could be conceived as milieus of left-wing socialization, the content is different, because in the case of having working class parents, that means economically left-wing preferences or favorable towards redistribution, but it also means more culturally authoritarian preferences, right? On the issues of immigration and on the issue of the rights of lesbians and gays, right? So individuals who have parents in the working class are more likely to be more culturally authoritarian than individuals who have parents in the old middle class. And for the sociocultural professionals, we see this operating in the other direction, right? And you have to always remember that here we are already controlling for people's own social class, right? So this is beyond the effect of own class location. If we look at party closeness, because in particular, right, we are interested in trying to disentangle, or I don't know, maybe it's just this is our personal obsession, and then you will tell us that that is not interesting, right? But to try to pin down where these stronger effects we observe for the working class and the social democrats is coming from. And so in part, we thought this could be due to more of a closeness or party identification with that particular party, the Social Democrats. But if we look at differences by party closeness, we do not see any big differences based on that, right? So also here, we do not I mean, if we had seen a huge effect here for having working class parents, right, we would be saying, okay, so that's a lot of the intergenerational transmission of party identity. That's what makes this working class legacy much stronger than the sociocultural professional legacy we observe later on. But we don't really see that. And so again, and as a last step, we're repeating the same exercise, but differentiating by generation, right? Because again, these kind of effects of parental class of origin or legacies are not expected to operate in the same way earlier on or in the present. And the results are very, very similar to what we observe in terms of political behavior, but I think some still very interesting patterns, right? Let's look, for instance, first at ideological self-placement. In the older generation, having working class parents is associated to a higher or to a more left-wing positioning, right? But we don't observe this anymore for the youngest generation, for millennials, right? So millennials who have working class parents are not more likely to position themselves on the left or more towards the left than the old middle class, which is the class that is positioned farthest to the right when we place our classes in the ideological placement, right? But on the other hand, we're seeing this increasing attachment with a left-wing ideology among sociocultural professionals, right? So the social classes that seem to be transmitting an attachment to a left-wing ideology today are rather the sociocultural professional class and not so much the working class as it used to be, right? So we really see a kind of reversal of these patterns over time. For economic preferences, it is a lot more stable in terms of the working class, and we see a marginal increase also for the sociocultural professionals. And then for the cultural attitudes, right, we also see a little bit of a reinforcement of offspring of workers becoming more culturally authoritarian as we move from older to younger generations, right? So also highlighting that phenomenon, which is or related to to how recent this phenomenon is, right? So matching what we would expect in terms of what we see due or based on the political behavior of the different classes. And then for closeness to different political parties, we do not see really any significant differences. And then last slide, this I will be very, very brief. We did some mediation analysis, and we're trying to see to what extent we can account for these differences in terms of political behavior based on the different variables we're taking into account, ideology and preferences, and also ideology and closeness. And I think what's still kind of like puzzling us is that we cannot really account for a lot of that attachment for the social democrats among the working class. So what do we conclude from this? First of all, I think it's important to bear in mind that social class of origin still matters, right? And that early socialization in the family continues to be related to party choice later in life, right? And beyond individuals' own occupational situation. And this is from other research we have conducted. We see that some of this is also important because social class of origin is underlying processes of educational and occupational selection later on in life. And some of the current alignment that we see with the left today is still a legacy from those working class origins, right? So something that we may ask ourselves is to what extent will the left be able to capitalize on this sociocultural professional support when they're not children from working class anymore, right? Because this is changing over time and they're becoming a smaller and smaller portion of the electorate that we observe with these working class origins, right? And the working class origins generate this attachment to a left-wing ideology, to positions that are more favorable towards redistribution, but cultural conservatism, right? And this attachment to a left-wing ideology is even diluting in younger generations, even though the differences on values remain stable, and we cannot explain the stronger impact of working class versus other origins based on this, right? And this is why also something that we want to focus on, but we need other data to explore this, is on subjective class identity, because we think that this could be some one of the factors that is explaining this particular effect we see for the working class. We see that this new legacy, so sociocultural professionals as a class of origin, seems to be a new milieu of left-wing socialization, but it is rather for green and left libertarian parties, right? Because if you remember, it's a left-wing ideology, but it's a left-wing ideology on both dimensions, right? Economic and cultural. And something we cannot fully account for, these legacies, is all the variables that we have looked at. And so maybe here, before concluding, a couple of words on the next steps that we want to look at. As next steps, we want to replicate some of this analysis with, so we have two ideas or two strategies. One idea is that our measure of extent of realignment of the political system for this analysis is quite crude, right? Because we only have generation, right? And we're assuming that older generations were socialized in more industry-aligned political systems and younger generations in more realigned systems. But that is not the case everywhere, right? And as I was saying earlier, if we look at Southern Europe, for instance, this pattern is more recent, right? So we cannot compare the situation in Spain, Greece, or Italy in the 80s to what was happening in Germany or Denmark, right? So one thing we want to look at is, instead of looking at this by generation, is to take a more direct measure of degree of realignment at the time individuals were socialized. So when they were 14, 15 years old. So that is one way to go with this data. That's one way. That's one of the things we want to do. The other thing that we want to do is to replicate some of this analysis with panel data, with the UK, Switzerland, and German data. There we run into some difficulties because some of these preferences, right, are not asked systematically in panel data. So yes, there's a trade-off between one or the other, right? Either having more crude or relying on cross-sectional data and not really observing the timing of this process, or being able to look at the timing of these processes, but then losing out some of these informations on the mechanisms that might be operating. Because for instance, in the UK and in Switzerland, this data is available, but in Germany, we don't have that. You only have ideological placement and party preferences, and that's it. The GSEP doesn't include any other political data, which for us is important. And then it's also, I think it's interesting, and it's maybe a little bit out of topic, but a very short reflection on some of this, on working at with some of this data from a political sociology kind of perspective, is that you either have really good household panels that have really good sociological variables, or you have good political panels that don't have any of the sociological variables. And so when you want to have the two, then it gets really tricky, because you have some very good data, like list panel, for instance, is also really good, but there's no information on parental class of origin there, right? Because it's data that is also hard to collect and costly to code. So I feel that when you're working in this area of kind of like political sociology, you can have either the good sociological measure or the good political measures, but it's really tricky to have the best of both worlds together. But thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions.